Welcome to GPS for Community Foundations, Giving Day Planning and Strategies, presented by Kimbia. My name is Spencer Whelan, and I'm founder and president at Proclaim Advocates, LLC. I've worked with Kimbia for many years on giving events just like the one you're about to host, and together we've learned some of the best ways to navigate the road to a successful giving day. We hope that by the end of this presentation, you'll have the basic knowledge you need to lead your own team over the next few months. First, let's begin by calibrating where we are today. At this point, you're probably 4 or 5 months out from your scheduled community giving day. As you begin your planning, there are 4 key areas we must address. First, we need to calibrate our own expectations and begin to define and communicate the true role of the Community Foundation during this event. Next, we need to think about setting up the event's rules and avoiding some common hazards along the way. Then, we'll need to look internally and examine how we plan on managing our team's resources and workload. Finally, we'll want to make a formal plan by mapping out the exact route that will help you arrive safely at your giving day. We need to start by calibrating everyone's expectations as to the true role of the Community Foundation. How you think of yourself sets the tone for how the public will perceive you and how nonprofit participants will interact with you during the event. To use a driving metaphor, I believe a community foundation should think of themselves like the Department of Public Safety, as opposed to something like, say, a bus driver. You see, a bus driver is responsible for getting his or her passengers just to their stop, whereas the DPS is responsible for creating an entire environment and a system that benefits the general public at large. Similarly, for a giving event, the Community Foundation should primarily govern the event and provide it as a public service. It should determine the rules by which all the event participants must abide, and it should establish goals that promote community, ensure safety, and encourage efficiency. What the Community Foundation should not do is take on the responsibility for driving every organization to ensure that they reach their goals. It should also not be responsible for mapping out the exact path that every organization has to take. And finally, it's very important not to allow free riders or people who are looking for some shortcuts to get some easy money. This ultimately discourages investment and excitement from donors and other participating organizations. So now, let's talk about some of the rules of the road. Setting your event's rules and picking your incentives are probably the single most important factor to creating and controlling the kinds of traffic you want on your giving day. First, it's important to understand that the criteria for setting rules and incentives should be based on one of 4 key goals: dollar volume, donor volume, and expanded donor base, or community awareness. A dollar volume goal is pretty straightforward. This would be your goal if you want to make a big impact on the community with the sheer volume of money raised in one day. An example of what a public goal would be is to say something like, the most money our city has ever raised in one day is $1 million, and our goal this year is to double it to $2 million. If this is your goal, some good advice is to set a number that is reasonable. Make sure it is a goal that you feel comfortable hitting, or that you can project you will exceed by 50% or more. You want to push yourselves, but it's important to pick a number that is achievable. Donor volume is the next type of goal you could set, and obviously this just means setting a goal for donor participation in the event. For example, your public goal could be something like 24,000 gifts in 24 hours. This is a great goal to set if the dollar figure is a bit unclear, but you know you can hit an impressive donor engagement number. If this is your goal, one thing you can do is to encourage current donors and philanthropists to plan their giving in advance and make multiple gifts during the event. Next is the goal of an expanded donor base. This is a bit more of a subtle message, but aligning around this goal means educating and motivating new and first-time donors to start participating in public philanthropy. This may be a good goal if you live in a city with a higher population of young professionals who are not used to making charitable gifts. For example, say your city has an online giving rate of only about 5% of the total population. Make your public goal a 10% online giving event and encourage people to make their first gift online through this event. Finally, there's the goal of general awareness and education about your community foundation and local philanthropy in general. This may be an important goal to set if your community foundation is new or just now beginning to advocate for public fundraising. In this scenario, you set up public goals for things like nonprofit participation and building their capacity to fundraise online. In all of your public outreach efforts, you would emphasize things like nonprofit training sessions and developing relationships with local businesses and media outlets. The event would still track things like total dollars and total donors, but your public emphasis would be on how nonprofits learned through this process and how the Giving Day has acted like a Kickstarter for future events to come. One important recommendation here is to understand the difference between your internal and external goals. We strongly recommend that you set clearly defined goals and metrics for each of the 4 items above. However, go to the public with a message that's oriented around only one of these goals. This will focus the community around something marketable and memorable. Now that you've picked your goals, it's time to translate that into messaging and incentives. So, if your goal is sheer dollar volume, then perhaps you want to encourage large dollar transactions early in the process. This will help your Giving Day narrative become one of surprise and the staggering generosity of the community. This means you'll probably also want to similarly focus your incentives, things like a percentage match within the first hour of the event, or perhaps a bonus prize for the nonprofit with the largest per gift average. If your public goal is donor volume, then you likely want to encourage a large number of gifts that occur early in the day and then continue with repeat donations. In this case, you really want to push a narrative of record participation, so that the buzz builds early and encourages any kind of gift. In this case, you may want to build incentives like early bird prizes for organizations with 50 or more qualifying gifts. You may also want to do something like orienting your grand prize around the largest number of gifts in 24 hours. If your goal is to increase engagement around new or lapsed donors, then your focus should be on encouraging nonprofit discovery and creating public events that encourage bandwagoning and impulse giving. In other words, you want people to be surprised by all the activity in the community and feel the social incentive to join in on the fun. For this, you want to build your incentives around advocacy metrics. These include things like power hours, where you incentivize activity by giving prizes for the most gifts or dollars within a certain 1-hour period. It usually makes sense to couple this with some planned in-person events around the city. Another example is to build incentives around trending organizations. Perhaps you build bonuses for organizations that have stayed in the top 10 on the leaderboard for the longest period of time. Just something to incentivize advocates who want to keep the progress going. Finally, if your goal is around community awareness, it makes sense to encourage activities that will primarily translate well into media stories and social media mentions. This means building incentives around publicity actions. For example, perhaps your corporate partners can sponsor day parts, where their contribution impacts the matching pool only during selected hours. In this case, a corporate partner is more likely to try and acquire media attention by mobilizing their employees during their sponsored window. Another example we've seen work is the Opening Acts incentive. This is an incentive program where the first 5 to 10 organizations who register and complete training for their Giving Day will receive a special media event at their location with a live music act or a local celebrity. This really encourages nonprofit participation and creates great visuals for local media exposure. There are tons of great ideas for incentives that encourage participation, and we hope that you can be creative and come up with some of your own. On the other hand, there's just a couple of incentives that you probably want to avoid. These incentives, while extremely well-intentioned, can actually cause more harm than good. For example, it's probably best to avoid an incentive prize that is simply divided equally between all nonprofits who register for the giving event. This incentivizes participation, but not necessarily activity, which could result in many organizations deciding to be satisfied with receiving anything at all. Also, it tends to alienate the leaders within your community who are crucial to getting the event started on the right tone. Something else to avoid is building too many incentive bonuses. Usually these are designed so that an organization can win only one, and there's enough total prizes to give everyone a chance to win something. Unfortunately, this creates an atmosphere that's more like a sweepstakes rather than a competition. It can cause animosity between organizations and among donors if the prizes seem to be based more on luck rather than fundraising performance. At the end of the day, you should try to select a few sizable and well-crafted incentive prizes that promote an atmosphere of healthy competition. Next, let's talk about managing the workload. It's important that your internal resources are well managed so that everything's ready to go for Giving Day without overstressing your team. So we've developed some guides to help you plan for the roles and responsibilities needed in the coming months. For a giving event, your internal workforce will likely be divided between 4 areas of discipline. All 4 are equally important in function, but some areas require more time than others. In our experience, nonprofit and partner relations, along with marketing and PR, will require the largest amount of your staff's time. In terms of pure work hours, on average, these disciplines require at least 1 or more staff members dedicating almost all of their time to this role. Next is the event logistics, technology management, and support. This requires a bit less time due to the fact that you have a technology partner like Kimbia, but it's still a role that needs to be filled internally. Finally, there's a need for a decision maker or a manager who can oversee and interact with all 3 other disciplines. This chart is designed to help you understand how a typical giving event impacts your resources during the 5 months prior. In each month, you'll see a resource icon that's filled somewhere between 25 and 100% of a full-time employee, based on a 40-hour work week. At the edges of the chart, you can see the summary for the percent of time dedicated to each discipline and the total numbers of people who will be utilized each month. Some things to note from this chart are as follows. First, notice that each month requires at least the equivalent of 2 people working on Giving Day planning activities. In the intense period immediately before the event on May 6th, you may need as many as 4 or more people working at a time. Second, notice how nonprofit and partner relations is the most constantly active role throughout the 5 months. This, along with marketing and PR support, might mean you need to assign dedicated individuals to both of those roles. Finally, the manager's role should be less consistently active, especially if you've planned your team responsibilities well. That person may be able to work across all disciplines and help wherever they're needed. So let's summarize some key recommendations that we can take from this. First, it's probably best to assign 2 to 3 dedicated staff members to this project based on the expected workload. As you get closer to Giving Day itself, you may want to ramp up to 3 to 5 full-time staff or volunteers to help your core team. Finally, it's also wise to make nonprofit relations and marketing your first priorities from a time management perspective. This is where a community foundation will see the greatest return on your time investment. Now that we've talked about calibrating expectations, setting up our events rules, and managing our expected workload, it's time we discussed building a set of turn-by-turn directions for us to follow towards the Giving Day. As we've discussed, you must start by knowing your goal and working backwards to chart a course. We're going to quickly go through the key points above and discuss how to specifically approach each turn along the way. First, let's start with your internal organization. Expectations are obviously important, so go ahead and take every appropriate step now to formally communicate with your staff and board members. Also, in addition to this training, seek out information from other events and see what they've done successfully. Next, decide on specifics. Formalize and publicize things like your event partners, venues, deadlines, and your incentive structures. Have your marketing team finalize branding and visual identity materials along with a media plan for the next months. Next, get your internal team primed by finalizing and socializing the website. If you haven't already, make sure that you have an active social media account in all the major social media networks. Make sure people know how to use it internally and that everyone on your team follows those channels. Then, find your most influential local leaders and just start talking about the event with them and get the buzz going early. With your internal team primed, you can start working outward by engaging your partners first. Start by building a street team composed of sponsors, benefactors, and active nonprofits who can commit to being public advocates for the event. Perhaps it would be a good idea to launch a large kickoff event to kind of grease the wheels with your most influential partners. This should be an exciting educational and networking event that proves the Community Foundation can bring people together and make it easy to work together. Now let's move a little further out into the community with some larger engagement activities. Recruit your local media partners to either sponsor or provide in-kind contributions to the event. Have your marketing and PR team work with them regularly and give them exclusive access to the news as it develops. Reach out to local VIPs and recruit them to become your community ambassadors. Ask them to use their business relationships to find additional sponsors. And be sure to feature these individuals and their actions throughout your social media channels. Speaking of social media, this is the point in which you really should have a coordinated messaging campaign in place. Your internal staff should be posting something at least daily across all major networks. Also, be sure to monitor all activity online so that you can respond or repost messages from your advocates. The next step is the active promotion of your creative elements and your media plan. This can vary widely between organizations, and much of the activity depends on how much budget and in-kind support you've already received. If you can, allocate a budget or find a partner to help develop some creative assets for the campaign. This is a digital fundraising effort. Therefore, assets like videos, images, and good iconography tend to be the most valuable. These are more likely to be reused by your partners and shared by your advocates. If you know that you'll have less budget for creative, then strongly encourage your nonprofit community to develop user-generated creative elements. You'll likely be surprised at just how much your organizations are willing to contribute. If you do encourage a crowdsourced creative model like this, then just prep your internal team to do all they can to promote, repost, and increase its exposure. Since the Giving Day is first and foremost an online event, it may be wise for you to invest in some paid digital media promotion. While it may seem daunting, you'd be surprised at how a targeted digital media campaign can easily be developed with just a budget and some free online campaign tools. A typical digital media plan can look something like this. First, allocate a budget to use about 6 to 8 weeks prior to the Giving Day. Divide that budget between Facebook, Google, and then some retargeting ad networks. Use 40 to 60% of that budget on Facebook to generate more engagement and increase the number of likes that you receive on your page. The more you build your likes early, the more reach you'll have organically by Giving Day. Use 30 to 40% of the budget on the Google Display Network, keyword ads, and video ads. Using Google's tools, you can target just about anyone in your city who's interested in this event. Have your ads point them to a special landing page on your site, giving them info about the event to come. Finally, I recommend that you spend about 10 to 20% of your budget on retargeting ads. With tools like AdRoll and Google Remarketing, you can show ads only to people who've been to your site before. This will be extremely helpful for the final push on Giving Day when you only want to target the most likely donors. Finally, the Giving Day is here and it's time to mobilize your community. At this point, there should be no question as to people's roles and responsibilities, so management should be pretty simple. Start by handing out everyone's marching orders. This means hosting a final conference call with all of your staff and participating nonprofits to give final details. Perhaps it makes sense to host a final meeting of all your ambassadors and give each of them a task to perform on the Giving Day. This is also the point where you want to set up your mission control room. This is a physical place for your internal staff, your support team, and your social media managers to meet and monitor progress during the day. Last but not least, it's time for your marketing team to push a flood of social media activity around the start of the Giving Day. Emails should be queued and sent, and social media messages should be ready. If you have any additional advertising budget, perhaps you should consider doing something like promoting hashtags, or even hosting a thunderclap. If you're not familiar with what that is, go check out thunderclap.it and learn how you could maximize a social media announcement. Finally, monitor and respond to everything on social media. Celebrate all positive messages and respond quickly to any negatives with transparency and honesty. At this point, it's very likely that the event will be successful and worthy of some big celebrations. Frankly, it's time to do a little bit of bragging and some thanking too. As you have throughout, give your local media partners the first crack at reporting your final numbers and coordinate that with your social media team. It may make sense to have a couple of things prepared in advance. For example, have a pre-formatted press release where you can quickly fill in some blanks and release it immediately after the event is complete. Perhaps you have a designer on staff who can turn the fundraising data into some infographics and share them through social media in the days following. Also, if you have any budget remaining, you may want to pay to promote some key posts and tweets, and even public thank you notes to reach a larger audience. Lastly, you'll need to take a breath for about a week or so. But come back together as a team and develop an after-action report while everything's still fresh in your memory. Your staff, your donors, and partners will all have valuable input for you to assess after a short time of reflection. Be sure to document this process and share your findings transparently with all stakeholders involved. Hopefully, this has provided you and your team with some good ideas about how to organize your own Giving Day strategies. We are all looking forward to seeing the fun and creative campaigns you develop over the next few months. Again, I'm Spencer Whelan, and on behalf of myself, Kimbia, and Proclaim Advocates, thank you so much for your time and attention. We are truly honored to be joining you on this journey.